Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 7th Annual Building a Competitive U.S. Mexico Border Conference, which the Mexico Institute is again delighted to co-sponsor with the Border Trade Alliance. We had a fantastic series of panels and discussions yesterday, and we have an equally promising lineup this afternoon. My name is Andrew Rudman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. For those of you who may not have been with us yesterday, I'll just mention a couple things. This conference has traditionally been an in-person event with a large delegation visiting Washington from the border region. We couldn't do that this year for obvious reasons, but we wanted to make sure we didn't allow another year to go by without again highlighting the important challenges and opportunities for the US-Mexico border region. Thanks to our co-sponsors, the Border Trade Alliance, as well. Without the help and enthusiasm from BTA President Britton Mullen, who you'll hear from a little bit later, and her team, Garrick Taylor and Amanda Roberts, we would not have been able to deliver this program. Today, we're going to begin with recorded remarks from Senator Mike Crapo. Senator Crapo has represented his home state of Idaho since 1993, first in the House of Representatives from 93 to 98, and since then in the US Senate. In the Senate, he's the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee and also serves on the Senate Banking Committee, the Senate Budget Committee, and the Joint Committee on Taxation. He is also Chief Deputy Whip for Senate Republicans. The senator holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a BA from Brigham Young University. Now, if we could play the video.
Hello. Thank you to the Woodrow Wilson Center's Mexico Institute and the Border Trade Alliance for inviting me to share some remarks today. And congratulations to Ambassador Mark Green for becoming the Center's most recent president. I look forward to working with you in this new capacity. The COVID-19 pandemic created unprecedented disruptions to the global economy and world trade, including through production shortages, supply chain interruptions, and collapses in consumption. In order to ensure the global economy fully rebounds, we need now, more than ever, a trade agenda that tears down barriers between our businesses, farmers, and workers, and the billions of customers beyond our borders. That agenda should include negotiating cutting-edge trade agreements like the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The USMCA contains important disciplines to facilitate digital trade, ensure agricultural regulatory measures are based on sound science, and to develop product standards transparently. Last month, I had the opportunity to meet with Mexico President Obrador during the one-year anniversary of the USMCA. We discussed the importance of building on its success and strengthening our North American trading relationships. In my home state of Idaho, the USMCA can provide farmers, ranchers, and small businesses new trading pathways if we implement and enforce it properly. It is critical that all countries comply with its market access commitments, and I'm working to make sure that happens. Unfortunately, barriers still remain. For example, Mexico limited the importation of potatoes to a limited border zone, purportedly to prevent plant pests. The USMCA requires these types of restrictions to be based on a scientific risk assessment. The risk assessment conducted by Mexico's own authorities found that the potatoes could be safely imported, and the Mexican Supreme Court eventually cleared the way and allowed the Mexican federal government to issue import regulations. While the decision was a positive step forward, I will not consider the matter finished until Idaho's farmers are able to sell high-quality potatoes to every family in Mexico, as is their right under the USMCA. Although we are seeing progress on that front, areas of regression are apparent elsewhere. Mexico is maintaining or enacting new restrictions on other U.S. agricultural products. These restrictions lack any scientific justification, including by failing to approve biotech crops. I will follow that issue closely as well. Beyond the USMCA, other smart trade policies enjoy broad bipartisan potential. In May, the Senate adopted, by an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 91-4, the Trade Act of 2021. The Trade Act of 2021 reauthorizes the Generalized System of Preferences program, which will lower tariffs on various goods from developing countries. It will also cut tariffs on imports that support American manufacturing by renewing the miscellaneous tariff bill. To be at its best, America must focus on strengthening competitiveness by being smart in the use of tariffs. As a nation, we've considerable work ahead. I look forward to further legislative progress and having further productive discussions with our Mexican trading allies, like on my most recent visit with Mexico's president, to ensure that North America remains the best place in the world to do business. Thank you.
During the pandemic, the US-Canadian border has also been closed to non-essential travel, which has led to many of the same frustrations and challenges that we've seen and talked about yesterday with respect to the US-Mexico border. Just this week, Canada relaxed its entry requirements for American citizens, though the US maintains its restrictions on Canadian entry via land ports of entry to essential travel only. Air travel to the US remains permitted, as is in the case of Mexico. To help us understand what is happening on the northern border and to explore potential lessons learned or best practices that are or should be implemented, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Chris Sands, the director of the Canada Institute here at the Wilson Center. Chris will moderate a panel discussion derived from the excellent work of the US-Canada Border Working Group, which Chris organizes. So with that, Chris, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm really pleased by just the opportunity, the invitation to come and talk about the northern border that the United States has in a conference focused on the southern border. I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and I always feel I learn a lot from you as well, Andrew. So let me introduce our terrific panel. It's an impressive group of people that I've known even for all of them collectively, I think for decades. It's frightening, but they are terrific. Starting from the West Coast, we have Dr. Lori Trotman, who is Director of the Border Policy Research Institute at Western Washington University. Moving to the Midwest, we come to Dr. Bill Anderson, who's Director of the Cross Border Institute at the University of Windsor, just across the river from Detroit. And then furthest east, we have Dr. Katherine Friedman, who's Research Associate Professor of Law and Planning at the University at Buffalo in Buffalo, New York. We'll move in that order. I've asked each of them just to give us a sense of the border from their research perspective, and then we'll hopefully have some good time for questions and answers with all of you in the audience. Over to you, Lori.
Well, hi, everyone, and thank you for having me to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I was able to join in on some of the discussion yesterday, and I really appreciated a lot of the comments that were made because I think while there's some differences between the borders, there's also a lot of parallels. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what made the Canada-US border function differently over the last year and a half, and then a little bit about some research that Katherine, Bill, and I and a number of other collaborators have worked on to measure the impacts along the Canada-US border. So one of the big difference on the northern border was Canada's restrictions, and the major one that we faced was the Federal Quarantine Act. And the Federal Quarantine Act applied to most non-essential travelers, including returning Canadians. So all of those people who were coming back from the US or were allowed to enter Canada and weren't considered essential were subject to a mandatory enforced 2-week quarantine. So an example of that might be my adult daughter lives in Vancouver. I'm just south of the border here in the US. And while I would be allowed to enter Canada over the last year and a half, I'd be subject to that mandatory 2-week quarantine. So you can imagine that was really pretty prohibitive for a lot of these people to be able to move back and forth who were already very constrained. And over the last year and a half, Canada has used the ArriveCAN system, which is a phone-based app to collect a lot of information related to quarantine, related to trip purpose, and now also related to vaccine status. So as Andrew mentioned, as of Monday, fully vaccinated Americans with the PCR test taken within 72 hours are allowed to enter Canada across the land and air border for any trip purpose. And much of the reason that's been allowed is because there is this app-based system in place to be used at the border. And as many of you likely know, USCBP has yet to develop a similar process for screening at the land border in particular. So just a quick note on the importance of the land border to US borderland communities. The dynamics are probably a little bit different than the southern border. Over 60% of travelers across the land border are Canadian, so Canadians really dominate the land border travel, and that means that a lot of the economic loss over the last year and a half was really felt very strongly in US communities. And these are communities that have built up industries that are almost exclusively reliant on Canadians and on a functioning land border environment. And as Andrew mentioned, Canadians have been able to fly into the US during this whole time, but that did virtually nothing to alleviate economic losses in borderland communities that are really tied together by the flow across the land border. And of course, we also had that returning quarantine for Canadians, which limited even air travel as well. So Bill and Katherine and I and 5 other colleagues looked at the impacts of the border restrictions in 8 different regions from Alaska all the way to Maine. And this is something we call the Border Barometer. It's a collaboration that we've tried to do every few years that really looks on the importance of the border and the functioning of the border, and also the regional nature of how the Canada-US border functions, because our policies really take kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to border policy. We certainly saw that during the restrictions, but cross-border regions function very differently. So they were impacted very differently. This is true, of course, in normal times, and it's something that I think is typically not appreciated by policymakers, particularly those who don't live and work in border communities. So our goal in this research project was really to illustrate those differences and make the case that crafting better border policy requires good data and ideas that are informed by stakeholders in cross-border communities who are experiencing firsthand every day the impacts of the border. And one, I guess, key takeaway or key message I would say is that if we've learned anything from the border restrictions, it's that we need to better understand the importance and the influence of the border. And I think that the moment that we're facing now really gives us the opportunity to do that. And one final point I'll make is that our research also looked at the role and the value of subnational networks and that collaboration that happens on a regional scale. I think over the last year and a half during the restrictions, there's been what I perceive as a really incredible lack of communication and engagement and transparency by both the Canadian and US governments. And having strong on-the-ground networks has really made a difference. I can speak to my region, which is the Western Washington, Western British Columbia region, kind of that Seattle, Vancouver corridor. And we really consistently and intentionally came together and had cross-border stakeholders convening every week, every other week, and we kept communication going. And that allowed us to have a very good channel between what was happening on the ground and our elected officials, whether in Congress or our governor at the state of Washington. And that enabled us to keep these people informed on the impacts of the border restrictions and what border communities were facing. So I'll leave it at that, Chris, and pass the torch. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Lori. And I think that cross-border communication has been a key element throughout. We certainly haven't heard a lot from capitals like this Washington, D.C. Let me turn now to Bill Anderson. Bill.
And people who know me will know I'm keeping my record perfect of always being muted when I start to speak. But let me focus a little bit on an area of research that we focus on at the Cross-Border Institute, which is the commercial side of the Canada-US border, the movement of goods across the Canada-US border. Remember, Canada actually in 2019 fell just short of the gigantic bilateral trade relationship between the United States and Mexico for the honor of being the largest bilateral trade relationship on earth. So this is an enormous relationship, and it mostly takes place by ground transportation. So mostly it goes through those, what we call land borders or highway borders, because mostly it goes by truck. So between 55 and 60% of the trade between the United States and Canada goes by truck. And the thing that drives this is cross-border supply chains. And so for the people that work on the Mexican border, this is a very familiar story. Not only is it cross-border supply chains, but the biggest single industry in those cross-border supply chains is the automotive industry. So when we began to have the COVID pandemic, there was the potential for an economic disaster because this large industrial complex in the Great Lakes region that straddles the Canada-US border can't function if you don't have this continual movement of goods back and forth across the border. Where we're located at the Detroit-Windsor border, it's on average about 7,000 trucks a day, but it can be as high as 10,000 trucks a day. And just to put it into some sort of perspective, in order to have an assembly plant located in Ontario, for example, in Canada, you need to have anywhere from 300 to 500 trucks a day coming across the border into Canada from the United States carrying auto parts. And so these supply chains are completely integrated across the border. And if the border had been shut down, and you know, it's popular for people to say, well, the border was shut down during the pandemic. In fact, truck movements have continued. So all of that reflects an agreement that was made between the United States and Canada in March of 2020 on the land border crossings, and particularly the highway border crossings. And that did two things, which were very important. One is it basically allowed the movement of goods in trucks to continue under some restrictions, but for the most part to continue. And it also allowed for the movement of people that are classified as essential back and forth across the Canada-US border, because in addition to these sort of broad scale industrial supply chain connections throughout the Great Lakes region, there are local connections, especially at the Detroit River and also at the Niagara River over where Kate is located, where there's actually a lot of commuting across the border. And in the case of Detroit and Windsor, Windsor, Ontario, there's a lot of movement of healthcare nurses and technicians and other healthcare professionals. If they hadn't been able to go back and forth across the border, as Detroit was at that time facing a crisis with the COVID pandemic and its hospital system, that would have all broken down. So if it wasn't for that agreement that was made between the United States and Canada in March of 2020, you really would have had two disasters. One would have been shutting down much of the industrial complex in the Great Lakes region, particularly in automotive, which would literally, there's no exaggeration to say, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of workers would have been laid idle if that were the case. Certainly tens of thousands of workers would not have been able to stay on the job. Our data analysis indicates that there was a reduction in the trade that took place in the months of March, April, and May, but it picked right back up, and for the rest of the time, that trade has been ongoing. And the other thing is that it was possible to have those healthcare workers moving back and forth across the border, and that averted what would have been a major crisis in the healthcare system in southeastern Michigan during that period. So from those results, that's a very good story in terms of Canada-US cooperation. It isn't perfect. I think that one of the things that comes out of all of this is that one thing that emerged from it is the fact that when we talk about essential, it's always a problem when it's up to the government to decide what's essential. And for the most part, the decision was made that those people that commute on a regular basis are essential, and those people that don't are not. It turns out that created some big problems for certain industries, especially the capital goods industries, and maybe we can get into that later on. I don't want to take too much time with that. But it's not to say that there hasn't been significant economic damage done as a result of the border restrictions that have taken place over the last 18 months or so. There have. But I think really overall, we stayed on track. The industrial complex that straddles the Canada-US border continued to function. And so that's something to say that's positive. And right now we're in a situation where the two governments are not coordinating what they're doing. They're doing opposite things. And so that means we've got a problem now, but we need to get back into that spirit of cooperation that we had earlier on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bill. And again, that question of coordination and where it happens and where it doesn't is so important on this particular border. Speaking of coordination, I'm reminded by the Mexico Institute to tell all of you who are watching this live that you can send in a question for any of our panelists to Mexico at wilsoncenter.org, Mexico at wilsoncenter.org, or you can send us a direct tweet at Mexico Institute. That's our Twitter handle, or that's their Twitter handle, but I'm borrowing it for a bit. With that, let me turn to Katherine Friedman.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I share my colleagues' gratitude for being invited to speak at this event this afternoon. And I have to say, Bill's remarks teed me up perfectly. So as he suggested, Canada and the United States did indeed avoid a disaster by implementing essential and non-essential restrictions at the border. That being said, there is a more nuanced story taking place because of the non-essential travel restrictions. And I just want to touch on a couple of different points. First, the non-essential travel restrictions did indeed have a tremendous economic impact on cross-border communities all along the 49th parallel. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of those economic impacts. All across the border, there are border operators, right? The folks who are in the trenches operating the crossings on a daily basis. In my region, in the Buffalo Niagara region, we have two main border operators, the Peace Bridge Authority and the Niagara Falls Bridge Authority, who operate 4 distinct bridges in our region. The border operators really were decimated over the last 17 months because for the most part, they rely on toll revenue to support their operations. When passenger travel declined roughly 98% between 2019 and 2020, that translated directly into millions of dollars of toll revenue that these authorities didn't have. Therefore, they had to put capital projects on hold. They either had to lay folks off or freeze hiring at their authorities. And what is most important to remember about this is they had to undergo these operational changes to adapt to their new reality, all while being expected by both federal governments to continue to operate 24/7 and perform services. So it really put the bridge operators in a bind, and they lost millions of dollars of revenue as a result of the non-essential travel restrictions. Secondly, as Bill alluded to, there are a lot of small business owners who travel across the border, if not daily, weekly, or monthly, whose businesses were negatively impacted by the non-essential border restrictions. Not everyone, even if you were a business person, you were not necessarily considered quote unquote essential. And for those small business owners who really depend on face-to-face contact, relationship building and networking, many of them saw a decline in their market share and a loss of profit because of the non-essential travel restrictions that were put in place. Third, as Lori suggested, industries on the US side of the border that are dependent on a Canadian clientele were severely impacted. So for example, retail shopping, tourism, entertainment, sports, each of these industries suffered economic loss because of the non-essential travel restrictions. I'm not sure if everyone can appreciate this, but for the Buffalo Bills, for example, I'll take our tremendous football team. Up to 20% of season ticket holders reside in Canada. That's a huge number of people, right? Who still are not able to cross the border for the season that's about to start. So there's a real economic impact there for the Bills organization. The Buffalo Sabres, who aren't doing quite as well, estimate that somewhere between 13 to 15% of their season ticket holders live in Canada. So you can see how the social and economic fabric of these cross-border communities is really interconnected, and as a result, folks on the US side of the border who are dependent on that Canadian clientele really have suffered over the last 17 months or so. Lori, I'd like to move to a second point of some of the research that we did with regard to the border barometer, and that involves stakeholder engagement. Lori touched on it in her remarks, and I would just like to highlight the importance of subnational entities like the Pacific Northwest Economic Region, like PENWR, which has been instrumental in moving the needle on much needed on elevating the conversation and demonstrating the need for a rational, transparent border policy. The Pacific Northwest, PENWR in particular, has done a tremendous job in terms of elevating that conversation, as has the Future Borders Coalition, which is a private sector entity that again is driving the conversation with regard to border policy in the next decade or so. Another stakeholder that isn't really mentioned much in the border conversation, which Chris alluded to, is Congress. As a whole, there was very little engagement on the part of Congress with regard to the northern border and northern border issues. The Northern Border Caucus was very, very vocal. It's comprised of congressional representatives in northern border states. And they have been very, very vocal in terms of the need to get a transparent border policy in place, in terms of the need to lift the non-essential travel restrictions. They've been trying to pressure the Biden administration, but so far to no avail. And so I think, broadly speaking, it raises some very interesting questions for us regarding the nature and the strength of our democratic institutions during this very, very interesting time when domestic politics really seems to be driving a lot of policies in the international arena. Third, and just very briefly, I know Andrew was looking for some recommendations or some best practice that could be drawn from the northern border that could provide insight to those of you who are observers of U.S. Mexico border issues or those of you who live and work on the southern border. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot. I'd be interested in what Chris and Bill and Lori have to say about this, because the Canadian restrictions have been lifted only 3 days ago. We're in day 3, so there hasn't been a lot of time to digest best practice or recommendations, but I'll offer my perspective and then open it up. So in my region, there were very few border delays when it came to Americans who were able to cross into Canada. Again, we have 4 bridges and there was a delay of 45 minutes reported at 1. So it seemed as if the process, as my Canadian colleagues say, that was set up, in terms of mandating that folks use the ArriveCAN app and upload their information ahead of time, but then also have hard copies available. It seems as if that worked. Not saying there haven't been glitches. I know in the crossing between Fort Francis, Ontario and International Falls, Minnesota, a 7-hour delay was reported. So each cross-border region is probably distinct in this area, but we experience very few hiccups. So using technology like an app might be a best practice or a recommendation. An obvious best practice would be to have the manpower in place to process. The fact that CBSA decided not to strike was a huge game changer for Monday's lifting of the restrictions. They negotiated, 36 hours deep into the night and were able to resolve their issues. But because of that, they were able to have the personnel in place to process all of these folks. Requiring travelers to be vaccinated seems reasonable to me. The 72 hour of the requirement that travelers have taken a 72-hour PCR COVID test prior to crossing. I don't know how practical that will be moving forward, simply because those tests run, and at the low end, $140 up to $300. So it's still prohibiting the free flow of people across the border. So that's a little bit of a challenge. I would just suggest that what we really need, and I think everybody has sort of alluded to it, is we really need a binational plan in place that provides criteria, that makes the process more transparent, and that really allows for predictability, because that's what business wants. Business wants predictability. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
Thank you very much. All very good points. And I'm going to pick up a little bit on your last one with a question. But before I do, just remind everyone who is watching live that you could send in a question to us at mexico@wilsoncenter.org, or tweet a question to us at Mexico Institute if you're a Twitter person. But yeah, Katherine, I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned and ask everyone about the whole predictable planning question. When the border restrictions were first imposed, they were presented as a 30-day expedient, and then they have been renewed on a 30-day basis going around. What I've heard a little bit, but I wonder whether you've heard the same thing, is that although that was designed to create some flexibility, as time wore on, the lack of a plan or a predictable, something that businesses could plan on or families could plan on, became more of an irritant as time went on. Is that something that you heard as well? Let's go in reverse order. I'll ask you, Katherine, then Bill, and then Lori.
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head, Chris. Understanding the need for flexibility. I think that stakeholders are becoming increasingly frustrated by the fact that, well, maybe it's not realistic to think that a plan would be in place in August of 2021, given the ebbs and flows of the pandemic. But I think what stakeholders, at least what I'm hearing, is that stakeholders are frustrated because there doesn't even seem to be a process in place to create a plan. And as we all know, government moves very slowly. But not only does there need to be the process, and then the planning, and then the plan, but then folks on the ground in cross-border regions all along the 49th parallel have to operationalize it. So that all of that together is going to take some time. And I have heard again that stakeholders are a little frustrated that there hasn't been more movement in a different direction.
Bill?
Yeah, I think that's what we've been hearing from stakeholders. We talk quite a bit to people in the business community, and this is the thing that says, they're saying, well, why this has been going on for a year and a half, and why do we not have a plan and not have things straightened out yet? And I think one of the reasons that we didn't see a lot of people at the border crossings, except for Fort Francis, which is an interesting case, but probably a few others as well, is really the fact that, if this is going to be tourism, people don't have time to plan, right? So it's August now. What am I going to do? Run out and rent a cottage in the Kawarthas or something like that? It's too late for that. So I don't think that's going to happen. In terms of, the what's happening this week, I was calling around frantically trying to get some feedback because, it's only, this is Wednesday, and it was only Monday that these things went in. And it's true that the lines haven't been that long, but most people that are observing are seeing that the sort of processing time at the primary inspection lines is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 minutes, and that will not do for tourism. Okay, so if we had the type of tourism that we would normally have on a weekend in July or August, and I've spent many hours going through those crossings at the wrong time on both the Niagara River and the Detroit River, that just would be a multiple hours delay. But because it's so late this season, I think it's okay because there just aren't that many cars. Fort Francis, Lake of the Woods is a place where a lot of Americans own cottages, and so I imagine So Fort Frances is right near Rainy River, Lake of the Woods, what we call Sunset Country in Ontario. It's the far western part of Ontario, and it's very much a tourist region. And many Americans own cottages on that big lake. And so I imagine that what we're seeing there is a lot of Americans trying to get their cottage into their cottages that they haven't been to for a long time. But I think in general, I mean, the biggest complaint, the biggest thing you hear from stakeholders on the business side is why wasn't there a plan? And why are being left in the dark? And of course, I mean, it's tough. It's not easy because you don't know what's going to happen with respect to the progress of the pandemic. We're already not where we hope to be, 2 or 3 months ago because of the current variants and all those types of things. So it is tough. But I think there's frustration on that. And so that, I think that's the lesson for the next time. We need to have something in place, at least some sort of template in place on how we proceed the next time around.
Thanks, Bill. Lori?
Well, I don't have much to add because I completely agree with Bill and Katherine, but I think from the people who, again, whose lives are really impacted and affected by the border restrictions, the lack of communication and transparency coming out of the White House and coming out of Ottawa really left people feeling like nothing was being done and the can was getting kicked down the road and nobody really cared. And whether or not that's true is one question, but I think the reality for many people who have been living this for 18 months now is that nobody really cares.
Grim but true. We have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience. The first one is related to the essential worker label. On the one hand, had they been able to expand the essential category, you might have alleviated some of the economic pain and personal discomfort that's come from the restrictions. On the other hand, you might have seen an increase in the spread of COVID. How do you strike the right balance? And was there more flexibility in the essential definition that would have helped, or would that have been a risk?
If I can address that, I mean, I think the process begins from the definition of essential sectors, and that is, it's not as simple as just saying, well, if you're an essential sector, you can cross that type of thing. There's more thought went into it than that. But the point is, what happened is that the people that were identified as essential were, for the most part, people that were like on TN visas and were crossing on a regular basis. So people that were commuting across the border, okay? And it's like marketing people, I won't go into this in detail, but people that sell equipment, that's a very, very big industry in Michigan and in Southwestern Ontario, that the equipment that builds the cars. And they sell it all over the world. They sell it into Mexico, and it's a very big, very advanced manufacturing. It's very hard. You can't just, it's not the type of thing I go on a website and click, a button and say, okay, I'm going to buy this, $250 million assembly line equipment. People have to go out to the sites. Procurement sometimes requires that they make site visits to the production site. And all of these things, if they're accompanied by, 2-week isolation, it just doesn't work. It just becomes too expensive. As a result of that, really, I think Canadian producers lost out because most of the market's in the United States, and it was really not worth it for anybody that's in the market for buying capital goods for industry to go to a Canadian producer because of all of these complications where it was unclear. And the other thing is that they say it was inconsistent, that sometimes you would get treated as though you're essential for the same thing, and the next time you're not. So sometimes you would get a surprise that said, oh, by the way, this person has to isolate for 2 weeks.
We have another question from the audience. Looking back to the Obama era, during the Obama era at the U.S. Mexico border, there were discussions of economic issues. There was the high-level economic dialogue that was established, but there was not a lot of engagement on the southern border with regard to DHS and some of the more regulatory side of the government. How do you find the relationship on the Canada-U.S. border on border transportation and supply chain issues? Is there something that we can learn from how Canada and the United States talk about homeland security, border security that could be exported or adapted to Mexico? Well, that's a question that stumped the band.
I don't want to talk too much. I really think that as in the U.S.-Canada case, these supply chain issues are things that are sort of worked out by the experts. And fortunately for them, if you look at the automotive industry, you've got some very, very big companies involved, and they have a lot of influence and whatnot. I don't know that it's any better on the U.S.-Mexico border, on U.S.-Canada border than it is on the U.S.-Mexico border, so I can't really comment on that.
All right, and maybe the last question I can squeak in here, because I know we're running right up on time, but we have another question from the audience, which is, should we have U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada senior level border gatherings every 6 months and make maybe a North American border management summit, particularly at a time when we're talking about advanced supply chains? Is this something that you think could be fruitful, especially if the U.S. continues to have similar policies for its northern and southern land borders? Coming out of the pandemic, could a more North American dialogue emerge? What do you think about that? And I want to particularly pick on you, Lori, and Katherine, because you talked a little bit about the local stakeholder engagement. So it was working at the local of, could this really be continental in scale, or would it not work at that level?
I think,
Yes.
yeah, I think it would work. I'll just briefly say, I mean, the value of relationships and ongoing relationships is, I think, what's most important, and also, you know, mixing together senior level people who have clout to make decisions, but not just elected officials who come and go, but mixing all of that together with people on the ground who really understand how the border works, how the borderland communities are impacted by different policies, to me would be an ideal sort of consortium. And then we can learn both, you know, between borders and across scales as well.
I wholeheartedly agree with Lori. We need representatives from each scale in government and across each sector. I think there's a real richness of creativity that could come out of that. And I would just mention, you know, the Biden administration does recognize the idea of North America. They have talked about it, they recognize it. You know, the dynamics, the domestic dynamics are such that I think it's making it very difficult to move the needle in that direction. But if not a North American border management summit, maybe border issues could be subsumed under, you know, some broader North American summit, some broader meeting of, you know, the three leaders of each country, and then, you know, have stakeholder meetings held simultaneously, or, you know, whatever, people can figure it out. But the point is that level of engagement is important. It sends a signal. And I do think that this idea of North America is on the Biden foreign policy agenda.
Excellent. Well, and I'm glad it is. Hopefully we'll have a North American Leaders Summit as well. Another good idea from the past that could come back. I want to thank all of you for sharing a little bit about what's going on the northern border with our Mexico Institute friends. Special thanks to Lori Trotman, Bill Anderson, and Katherine Friedman, but also thanks to Andrew Rudman, my colleague, for inviting us, and Britton Mullen with the Border Trade Alliance for thinking this wasn't such a crazy idea. We really are pleased to engage with you both. Thanks very much. And now let me pass it back to you.
Thank you, Chris, and I'll echo your thanks to the panel. Really great conversation. And while we know that the two borders are different in so many ways, I think it's always illustrative to hear the ways in which the challenges are, in fact, quite similar. We are going to now switch back to the southern border, the southern U.S. border, and our next panel will focus on the impact of the COVID pandemic on cross-border business. We've assembled a binational panel to share experiences and recommendations, and I'm delighted to pass the baton, as it were, to Britton Mullen, the president of BTA and our co-sponsor, to moderate this discussion.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank all of you for participating today. Our panel today will assess the state of the border economy, what's working, what's not, and what potential solutions are emerging as we have persistent challenges. This discussion, of course, takes place against the backdrop of a pandemic that has injected a profound level of uncertainty and complication into the border economy. I'm proud to introduce our panelists today. Sergio Mendoza, the president of Desarrollo Chihuahua; Hector Serna, the president and CEO of IBC Bank in Eagle Pass, Texas; Sergio Contreras, the chairman of the BTA Board of Directors and the president of the Rio Grande Valley Partnership; and Jorge Gortochio, the CEO of Cross Border Express in San Diego and Tijuana. Good afternoon, all of you. Thanks for being here. Hector, let's start with you. What's the state of the border economy from where you sit? We've endured strict restrictions on cross-border travel through the land port since March of last year. What effect has this had in the communities like Eagle Pass and the other communities where International Bank of Commerce does business?
Thank you, Britton, and thanks to BTA and the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute for coordinating this conference. Hopefully next year we'll be able to join in person in Washington.
Right.
And I mean, we like to say that living on the U.S. Mexico border is truly unique, as we live in communities that happen to be in two different countries. We say one city, two countries. Our social, our cultural and economic ties are intertwined, and it's quite common for people to live in one country and work in the other, yet we live in the same community. It's common for siblings to work and shop and worship in different countries, yet we live in the same community. Again, one city, two countries.
Right.
The border travel restrictions that were talked about earlier for so-called non-essential travel has created significant challenges for everyday life on the border communities. In Texas, we have the Rio Grande River, or Rio Bravo as it's named in Mexico, that connects Texas to Mexico. And we have bridges that span from one side to the other. In my case, it's the bridges in Eagle Pass that connect the Piedras Negras, Coahuila. I want to put a little DC perspective, if you will. It's like the Key Bridge or the Theodore Roosevelt Bridge or the 14th Street bridges that connect Arlington, Virginia to Washington, D.C. Imagine if those bridges were closed to folks from Arlington and they couldn't get to use those bridges, and they suddenly closed. You couldn't conduct business or shop in D.C. And I'm sure that would create a major challenge from one day to another to be cut off. Well, that's what happened to us. That's what happened to the Texas-Mexico border. That's what happened to the U.S.-Mexico border, where in many cases there were 60 to 70% of our economic base was on the Mexican side, and perhaps challenging is not the right word. It was devastating. It's been devastating to our local economy. So all along the Texas-Mexico border, hundreds of small businesses have shuttered, and it's because they were deprived of their customer base, resulting from the so-called non-essential travel ban. We believe it's completely arbitrary and very disappointing, but many small businesses won't reopen. They're gone for good. It's sad to tour our border central business districts because the retail and the commercial sectors have less than 50% occupancy. So, the bottom line is the travel ban uncertainty is lethal to businesses and our communities. The restrictions have extended now with 17 consecutive months, and the frustration levels have exploded. And it's really the uncertainty. I think the prior panel was talking about predictability, and the uncertainty of the border reopening is the huge issue. After so many months, the administration, hasn't announced a plan. Again, the prior panel talked about a reopening plan, and border businesses are starting for that certainty and that predictability. The plan to reopen the border. So think about it. How can businesses operate with the uncertainty, where that a significant portion of the percentage of your business isn't allowed to reach your place of business? So the reality is that we need to open the border, reopen the U.S.-Mexico border. It's killing our economies that call on or that weigh heavily on Mexican shoppers and consumers. So one message, I guess, and something that we should really work on is for the administration to work with private sector stakeholders and really have private sector meetings. I think we talked a little bit about that. And also at the senior level, we need to have them directly to understand what it is and to really live and work on the U.S. Mexico border. So it's necessary for them to deal with the government creates the mess. We have to deal with it. So we ought to be able to sit at the table and take a look at that.
Well, per usual, you are spot on. And as you are very aware, the BTA has been asking this administration, calling on a regular basis for the certainty and for a plan. And we will continue to do just that. And thank you, Hector. Your points are so very valid and spot on.
Thank
so,
you.
Sergio Contreras, Mr. Chairman. So what are you hearing as the leader of the regional chamber in South Texas about the economy, and to what extent has the pandemic interrupted your region's growth?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you to BTA and the Wilson Center for hosting the 7th annual conference. Britton, thank you for your leadership. Certainly appreciate the opportunity. COVID impacted each and every industry, with some doing better than others during the pandemic and crippling many, right? Today's conversation amongst our investors is that they are in search of investment. Real estate sector being one of them. They continue to grow here across the region and in fact across the state, providing opportunities for investment in that sector. Through the RGB partnership, we host monthly conversations with our local EDCs. And for the most part, each has stated they have multiple subdivision permits in place. In fact, Brownsville is taking the lead since SpaceX has brought in about 1,500 new residents to that area. So that demonstrates that specific sector it continues to grow. You obviously have the concerns of the pricing amongst the materials that are needed and sometimes the lack of supply. However, it's an industry that continues to grow. Unfortunately, as others have stated throughout the conference, is that the restrictions have really impacted a lot of our retail services that are dependent on the Mexican shopper. Those merchants that are in downtown, close to our border crossings, it impacts their retail bottom line right about 40% with some of them. And bankers from across the border have stated that folks during the pandemic, investors were sitting on cash, waiting to overcome COVID so that they could get back into investments. As an example, here in the Rio Grande Valley, during the pandemic and even currently now, we've seen retail sales grow in double digits. Now we got folks shopping here locally. We got folks doing repairs for their homestead. However, there's only so many times you can actually fix your porch or paint the home, right? We also had folks purchasing items that they weren't accustomed to. Also buying more than what they needed, ensuring just to have items at home. However, that's carried over to this year as well. And so we see that also our employers are hiring. Britain, in fact, this year is one of the first years where we've really engaged with the business community in job fairs. So we announced a job fair here 2 weeks ago in 2 parts of our region. And each one of those is already at capacity, with each job fair having 100 employers. We had to put a stop to it because of the capacity of the convention halls. So we do see also employers searching for employees, meaning that we're hiring. Now, obviously, everyone's being cautious because of the variant. However, there is positive outcomes when it comes to those specific sectors in regards to the economy here in the region. And we can dive into others, right? However, limited with time, I'll address those as well. So thank you for that, Britton.
Thank you, Sergio. Keep up. Make sure that those job fairs continue. They're certainly needed. Sergio Mendoza, what's it like to be an economic developer during a global pandemic? Is Chihuahua still an attractive place to invest? I believe you're muted.
Famous words these days.
Right.
Well, thank you to the Wilson Center for having me, and thank you for organizing this event. I am the president, I'm the president of the Chihuahua Economic Development Council, which is a private sector organization that fosters and promotes public policies geared towards achieving growth in our economy. And Chihuahua, which borders with Texas and New Mexico, is the #1 exporter in terms of Mexican states to the US. We have been the leaders of the exports to the US for the last 15 years. Business hasn't stopped during the pandemic. The recovery, though, has been uneven because some small businesses, as Hector said before, are gone for good. They're not coming back. And for example, in commerce, some of the things we have been seeing is a huge growth in Amazon Mexico and the Mexican eBay, which is called Mercado Libre, at the expense of these small businesses in the border, because, Amazon has increased their logistic capabilities into Mexico a great deal, and they have found the market, which is sad for regional border towns and communities. As far as the industrial transactions, we've really been recovered since last year. I mean, the automotive industry, the aerospace industry, a little bit less than the automotive, have been seeing orders recover. And the only thing stopping even more growth in the automotive sector is the current global chip crisis. If it weren't for that, we would be seeing probably 2-digit growth, which is unbelievable. And what is happening right now in the border states is that we have full employment. We cannot find people. Wages are going up, costs are going up, and of course the U.S. inflation is also having an impact on our inflation in Mexico. The cost of goods and raw materials is going up, and it's affecting the profitability of some businesses.
Hi. Yes, while Britain is reconnecting, I think maybe what we can do now, Jorge, why don't we bring you into the conversation? I'd love to have you tell everyone a little bit about what exactly CBX is and what has been your experience particularly during the non-essential border crossing closures.
Absolutely, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Wilson Center for the invitation and to join this important panel today. So yeah, let me share who we are. Cross Border Express is a direct, secure boarding crossing between San Diego and the Tijuana International Airport for ticketed airline passengers only. We offer airline passengers a convenient alternative to accessing the airport, avoiding the congested land port of entry of San Isidro and Otay. Tijuana International Airport gives access to flights to more than 35 destinations in Mexico at very competitive rates and offers more frequencies than any other airports in Southern California. CBX was open to the public in December 2015. We have served more than 11.5 million users, and we have consistently surpassed our expectations. In 2019, we reached our peak level by serving more than or close to 3 million users. This project represents a substantial private investment in public infrastructure and is truly an economic engine to the San Diego region. Tijuana, since CBX was open, has become the fastest airport, or the fastest growth airport in Latin America because of this project. So answering your question, well, currently any Mexican travel can arrive by air to the United States, has no bans to enter the United States by air, and actually has been able to develop a new market, which is the Mexicans coming to the US for vaccination. The airlines has posed great results, and the traffic between the two countries has really already reached 2019 levels. But Mexico has done a great part on this achievement, because there's no restrictions to travel to Mexico, and many beach destinations have been able to take advantage of all the US leisure traffic that finds that Mexico is a really good place to travel. And as well, they have found that the Mexican travel industry has taken appropriate measures to protect travelers here. So I thought that CBX functions more like an airport boarding crossing. We're not. We only serve, as I mentioned, airline ticketed passengers, but our designation is a land port of entry. And as such, we estimate that we have lost between 50 to 70,000 Mexican leisure passengers per month who has been prohibited to cross through our facility since March 2020. Very interesting fact is that Tijuana Airport already recovered the level of passengers before pandemic, and reached a new high level in July with more than 1 million users. And the reason is because residents in the US have been able to cross to Mexico and take advantage of this. But again, as I mentioned, our passengers have been diverted to other US airports and bypass the San Diego region altogether, which relies really this region on the tourism economy. Just to give you an example, the car rental companies that operate out of CBX still down 80% from 2019 sales. And we, as a company, on a yearly basis, we estimate that 850,000 passengers, Mexican passengers, won't be able to cross to the US because of these bans. So we're really looking forward to rebuild our stability in the region and the hospitality sector by allowing Mexican passengers to cross to the US.
Thanks. I'm not sure if Britton has been able to rejoin us.
I am, and we're working on the camera. My apologies.
Okay.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you, Jorge. I heard most of your answer, and we certainly appreciate all that you do and the challenges that you face, that you work through. So thank you. Hector, I'll go back to you. Do you care to comment on the disparity between air and land travel down at Eagle Pass and the Laredo community?
Well, I think it's the entire country,
Yeah.
quite frankly. It's completely incongruent for the administration to allow travelers from Mexico and other countries to fly into the United States, into US airports, yet not allow the folks that enter the US via land ports. I mean, what is the difference? There's no indication that an entry from, say, Canada or United States into the US via the land port of entry poses any unique public health risk or threat compared to someone arriving via air travel. Those of us that are US citizens and live on the border, or legal residents for that matter, we're free to come and go to Mexico and return to the US as we've always done through the land ports of entry. And quite frankly, the irony, given the surge of migrants crossing the border illegally, and it's driven by the U.S. asylum laws, allows those migrants to seek safety once they've touched U.S. soil. And at that point, they're legal asylum seekers and are issued a permit to stay. Well, yet those who have been vetted by our government and and have entry visas and live in these communities are precluded from entering. So, I believe that we can agree that our immigration system is broken, and in reality, the problem isn't in the southern border; it's really in Washington. And even Congressman Cuellar mentioned that yesterday, and he wants to be part of the solution, not the problem. We must thoroughly modernize the U.S. immigration and asylum laws, and and really adequately address the workforce need of our economies immediately.
You're exactly right. Yes. Thank you. So let's talk about the USMCA. Sergio Contreras, have we seen whether the new agreement is making a difference economically, or is it too soon to say?
Britton, thank you for the question. And I recall when BTA and you in particular were engaging and leading the efforts of talking about the importance of the passing of the agreement of the USMCA. During that time, I recall also that financial institutions stated that they had multiple investment opportunities sitting on their desk, waiting for the agreement to be signed. And these were investments in the tune of 4 million up to 25 million when it comes to new warehouse space, cold storage facilities for the produce industry. And so what the agreement did, it added certainty. So fast forward past the USMCA, following up with these financial institutions, stating that in fact, yes, they had turned dirt and they actually had engaged in the investment. So overall, it did provide certainty in the marketplace. In addition to that, as we all have heard, and for those of you that have read, it brought up to speed certain components of the agreement of modern times. So it's been positive as well. You know, COVID demonstrated also the need to shorten our supply chain. And that is where we are continuing to hear and see investments. In fact, across our borders, we continue to see those opportunities and those investments. I'll be specific here on Texas and then expand in other parts of the country a little bit later. So here in Texas, you know, exports are well ahead of year to date, are well ahead of 2020, with an increase of over 60% over year 2020. So in 2021, June of 2021, we had a total output of 31.6 billion, up from 19.7 a year ago. So total reported for 2021 year to date was a total of 171 billion, up from 136 billion in 2020, again, June year to date. Across the nation in itself, we posted gains of June 2021 over June 2020 by 40% growth. Again, adding the importance of trade. And as we all know, example here in Texas, primarily exporting to Mexico. Now, if you heard to the most recent Senate hearing on USMCA year one, there's also quite a bit of room for improvement, in particular ensuring that each country abides to the letter, to the agreement in itself, that all came into as an agreement. So there's components there. If you listen to it, it highlighted several industries. You know, Britton, I know that you track the activity at our ports of entry. So for 2020, the busiest ports of entry in Laredo in regards to trucks, they had about 2.3 million trucks in 2020. Mesa in California had 927,000 trucks. FAR had 666,000. Nogales, 352,000, El Paso, 286. And across many of our ports of entry, they continue to see that increase when it comes to border crossings and legitimate trade. So it added certainty, opportunities are there. We continue to see investments at our industrial parks, and in fact, municipalities, EDC, investing in the infrastructure needed at our ports of entry to be able to sustain the warehouse space along those communities. Thank you, Britton.
Thank you, Sergio. Sergio Mendoza, what effect has the USMCA had in your region?
Again, it depends on the industry, but I'll give you an example. In the automotive industry, we have seen increased, significantly higher interest of automotive OEMs and tier ones to localize their purchases of parts, of components in the North American region. And this is 100% related to the increased requirements of regional content dictated by USMCA. And I have talked to a couple of buyers who have even told me they are not allowed to buy anything from China anymore. They need to find regional sources. And this, of course, is a challenge because, number one, bringing so much production from Asia to North America is a Herculean effort. And number two, again, it's hard to find people. And it's hard to find people in Cleveland. It's hard to find people in Chihuahua. It's hard to find people in Monterey. It's hard to find people. We're running out of people. So the challenge now is automation, smart industry, robotics, modernizing our production processes to reduce the labor content. And this, of course, requires heavy investments. But this is something that is happening. So we will see increased growth in these sectors. And some other industries as well, like medical devices, like electronics, things of that nature. They are all going to be localized sooner rather than later.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, thank you. Jorge, would you expect the economic ties between the U.S. and Mexico to grow stronger post-pandemic, especially as the USMCA matures?
Absolutely, Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no question. In my industry, tourism, the United States is the primary destination for Mexican travelers. In 2019, almost 18 million Mexicans traveled to the United States and represents 22% of the total foreign arrivals into the country, just second to Canada. According to the U.S. Department of Commerce National Travel and Tourism Office, spending of the Mexican travelers in 2018, which is the most recent year which data is available, it totaled $21 billion and represents an increase from 2017 figures. Mexican leisure travelers, even though they're still on a standstill to cross to the border, they're eager to come back and to impact that community. Just to mention that in international passengers arriving to San Diego, 70% of those are coming through CVX. So definitely it's going to create a huge impact after the travel restrictions get banned. And of course, in other industries, there's similar examples, right? That $2.5 billion co-producing manufacturing supply chain in the largest medical device cluster in the world, which is Cali Baja region. It's definitely, we saw how integrated our economy is and the disruption that these travel restrictions has created. So no question that when these restrictions get lifted, and it's going to have a revamp on every sector, because as it was already mentioned, we're intertwined. And just to add that for every 2 jobs that is created in the Baja region, for instance, 1 is created in San Diego. So just at least 460,000 jobs are dependent on the travel mix and in California. And that overall is more than 5 million in the US. So definitely having a safe reopening of the border could really impact economies in both sides of the border.
Absolutely. Jobs, jobs, and more jobs, right?
Absolutely. No question.
So let me remind the audience to please send in any questions that you may have for our panelists. We will be taking questions very shortly, so send them in, please. Hector, is the effect of the USMCA showing up in your dealings with your clients?
Absolutely. I think we should start off though with the premise that our economies are integrated,
Right.
socially, family ties, and really what happens at the border impacts the entire country. And fast and secure trade and fast and secure movement of goods and people on the U.S. Mexico border benefits everybody, not just the folks in South Texas or in Texas, but it benefits everyone. For the most part, our customers are pleased with the modernization of USMCA. This go around, I believe there were 34 chapters compared to 21 chapters in the prior agreement. It includes modernized chapters, and what Secretary Mendoza indicated strongly supports the and reinforces supply chain models that help the automotive industry. But nevertheless, there's other chapters that deal with competition and trade facilitation, et cetera, that were beneficial, and it really keep up with the this agreement will keep up with the times. However, key to the success of USMCA is to protect and respect a fully implemented USMCA as written. And you may be aware that the energy sector has had some changes by the Mexican government. They're game changers, and really this agreement was thoroughly negotiated by all three countries, and it should be fully implemented and embraced as such. So adding some non-tariff barriers, say in the form of permits, and only complicates the agreement that was previously negotiated. So we should protect the and respect the agreement as written, and it would be for the benefit of all concerned.
Thank you, Hector. Sergio Contreras, setting the pandemic aside, what are you hearing from your members about what they believe are barriers to strong growth?
The feedback we receive from our members, the business community, is investment to ensure that we have a skilled workforce. And then open dialogue amongst private and public organizations, speaking to the policies that are in place, how to improve them, how to reform, and ensuring that there's a business-friendly environment. In addition to that, which you've written front and center on this when it comes to investment at our ports of entry, technology, infrastructure, calling for an infrastructure investment overall, right? Also engagement, continued engagement in with trade associations such as VTA, engaging with the Wilson and others that have been over the years a champion, ensuring that there's those dialogues. And also getting folks back to work is key in itself. And of importance is to build on what we've learned over the last now going 18, 19 months. Build on that, and how is it that we can continue to grow as we are moving now. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergio. So a question from Ambassador Wayne. He asked how to best get border communities and states to better coordinate along the border to engage the federal government. The HLED is going to meet for the first time in 4 years in September next month. What should it address regarding border issues? Sergio Mendoza, do you want to
Sure.
kick it off?
We have an example here in El Paso, Juarez community, which we call the Borderplex Alliance, which is a group of business people from El Paso and from Juarez working on border issues on both sides of the river. And we really need to start by thinking like one city, two countries, like Hector Serna said before. That's the key. That's where you begin. If you start separating the Mexico side and the US side, then you're going to run into all kinds of issues pertaining to each particular country, and you are never going to think about this as one community. So that's the beginning. And the second is in these efforts of by national dialogue, there should also be people from the business community and from the city involved, not only government officials. You need to involve the business people, the guys who walk the streets, who cross the bridges, who do the business, who do the banking, who do the import-export processes. You need to get these people involved to start addressing real issues as fast as possible. That's
Absolutely.
my 2 cents.
Would anyone else like to comment?
Britain, this is Hector, and I think that absolutely hit the nail on the head. The participation from the private sector is key. Government folks don't really understand what it is to live on the U.S.-Mexico border and what it takes to cross goods and services. And the reality is that the private sector should be involved in all discussions, whether they're at a high level as the high level economic dialogue or at the local level. It should always be private sector involvement. Sometimes the elected officials mean well, but yet they don't have the practical or business experience. And absolutely, that would be the top on the list, to have private participation in these discussions.
Jorge, would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you, Brittany. I just would like to add that there's also policies that need to be revisit among the two countries to really help the development of the economic industries in both Mexico and the US. And there's processes that needs to be changed or updated, right? We all understand the need of having security among the border, but there's also opportunities to improve the processes and allow a more faster crossing. We just see in the pandemic, right? CBP was trying to disincentivize the border crosses and reduce inspection lanes, creating significant more waiting times than usually here. What about thinking of after pandemic and in the new vision of the two countries, how to make policies in the border that really align and make to have private investment as CDX. We built a bridge across the border, and this is a Mexican and US investment helping the two countries. There's so many projects that in different industries that can grow if we have a true alignment in different from the governments of each country.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. So does media reporting on the region's migration issues negatively affect the border's reputation and make economic development more difficult? I see Sergio Mendoza shaking his head.
I believe so. Especially in the northern states of the US, we get a bad rap, and I don't think it's fair. And most of these immigrants come from other countries, not from Mexico. Wages in Mexico have been going up. The incentive for Mexicans to go illegally into the US are less and less and less. And you have seen the net migration flow become negative in the last few years from Mexico, not from the south border. And this is a public relations issue that we need to work on, both of us. Well, it's a complex problem. The border is complex. It has many faces, and we need to address it one by one.
Sir Hector, would you like to add?
Absolutely. You know, the reality is that those of us that live and work on the border understand that it's not a war zone. And if you look at some of the talking heads on TV, whether it's cable or regardless of which channels you're looking at, the reality is that it's really blown out of proportion. And yeah, it's a bad rap for the border, and it does affect our investment. There's not, since we unfortunately don't operate as a one city, two countries format today, and we should going forward. We live it, but we don't have demographic information on the US side. So it's hard to attract sometimes investors which don't understand that in certain communities, you have 60 or 70% of your retail sales coming from folks that today can't cross. So yeah, the bad publicity, particularly from all the other states, are adversely affect investment on the border.
Thank you. Sergio Contreras, would you like to add any additional comments?
Thank you, Britton. Yes, it does impact, right? However, we as organizations need to continue to educate folks, use these opportunities as you presented, Britton, in the Wilson Center, to state that their economy continues to grow. And going back to the question of what should be addressed as the countries engage in conversation. And, the message has resonated, one region, one border, along those lines. With that, we should be honest with each other and also transparent and address key issues that impact both. The investment that occurs on the US side, on the border, the investment that occurs on the Mexico side, and how is that impacted by border violence? How will that be addressed? Having certain parameters in place, setting some goals, and measure those goals. Is it moving? Is it improving? Using rates that are out there that actually call to action. And if it doesn't change, then we ain't moving the needle much. And I'm calling on all components, whether it's the border violence on the Mexico side, whether it's the investment and incentive opportunities or their lack of, setting measures and being transparent on those as well.
Well said. Jorge, would you like to add any comments?
No, I think it does, but I echo what has been said here. I think we as private investors has a great opportunity to tackle some of these by talking about all the benefits and how the cities work together. It was early mentioned in Texas how communities integrate each other. We have a great example here in San Diego-Tijuana border, how the two cities work together, go to trade missions together, and work aligned in the private and public sector in different initiatives. And I think it's what we need to communicate. It's no question that the US government is under a lot of pressure because of immigration, and that perhaps has restrained to open the border among, of course, the pandemic. But there's a lot of things we can communicate and keep supporting the government on what is really happening in the regions, the economic benefits, and among many other things we could do together.
Absolutely. Jorge, turning back to you again. So talk about the supply chain challenges, especially the chip shortage.
Well, it's been really a huge issue here. First of all, I would say that I think nobody really estimate that travel would come back so fast, I would say, right? And the tourism industry will come back really, really fast. And that has created in the tourism industry a major issue of getting people back to work. But also it's not different in the supply chain. It's been a major issue to find people, and the relationship and again the ties between countries in different industries has created a lot of pressure to the industries itself, and that's perhaps opportunities we have together, having an immigration policies that allows people to work when jobs are needed. It's important. So yeah, I would say that yeah, it is a very, very tough situation. All industry has been facing really, really huge challenges on bringing people back to work. And yeah, hopefully it's getting better. Last month, job creation in the US reached, as you know, almost a million jobs, but still not enough to bring the supply chain in track, I would say.
Right. So Sergio also mentioned earlier a lack of qualified workers. How can government and business collaborate to develop skilled workers on both sides of the border? Sergio Mendoza?
Yeah, that's a good question. Training programs, support for schools that offer this type of retraining for people who have other jobs, other type of occupations. But this issue has, again, several avenues that need to be addressed. Number one is the appetite in the US for technical jobs, engineering jobs. It's not where it used to be. People are not drawn to automotive. People are not drawn to die casting or forging or industrial jobs as they were before. I'm talking about 20, 30 years ago. Younger people are looking for other type of employments. Here in Mexico, you do find these people, but the skill set is not there in the educational institutions. We need to do some kind of cross-training, cross-border training, where skilled people from communities that have been host to companies of these types, like Detroit, like Cleveland, to train our trainers here in Mexico. For example, do a die casting training program from Michigan with Chihuahua, or do a forging training program from somewhere in Ohio to Mexico, somewhere in Mexico.
Right.
The skill set is not here as widespread as the industry needs. So we need to accelerate these, and the one of the ways I think we can improve the speed is by sharing knowledge between our two countries. This will help us both.
Absolutely. Hector Serna, I'll turn to you to make any additional comments.
No question. I think we also need to take a step back and look at the fact that we're running out of workers and address immigration reform, whether immigration reform for the U.S., immigration reform for North America. There was a statistic not so long ago that over 10,000 baby boomers are retiring on a daily basis, and yet we have less than 9,000 babies being born. So we're not meeting up with the replacement of our workforce. And so one thing is to have those trainings in place and really laser focus on the type of industry that we're looking towards. Like in the last 20 years, we've moved on the U.S. Mexico border from cutting and the clothing industry into the automotive industry, and that we had trained folks to do that. But I think there's a bigger issue, and that's the grain of America that we need to address. and that can start with immigration reform. We were simply running out of workers, whether it be at high levels, engineers, architects, rocket scientists, to folks that work everyday jobs.
Thank you, Hector. Sergio Mendoza, I saw that you raised your hand.
Yes, let's not forget that baby boomers are going to retire sometime this decade. And that's the largest chunk of employees the US has. They're going to retire and they are going to become conservative investors.
Absolutely.
And that's something to think about.
Thank you. Jorge, any additional last comments that you would like to add as we wrap up our panel? And then Sergio Contreras, I'll turn to you for final remarks.
Thank you, Britton. Yeah, just to say there's plenty of opportunities to develop the economies of the two countries in the border region. I think we just have to work together with the governments to align the right incentives for companies to invest among the two countries to generate more jobs and industries. For example, and not only in the border side. Let me just give the example. In this panel was mentioned the immigration issue coming to the U.S. House had been reduced from the Mexican immigration. The state of Guanajuato was the #1 migrants sport many years ago, and it came just to reduce substantially the people leaving the state of Guanajuato by putting many auto manufacturers there to all the big companies went and invest in the state of Guanajuato. That's the type of opportunities we need to encourage private sector and governments to have the right incentives to invest, create jobs, generate richness in the countries, to stop immigration. And as it was said, it is important to have the right incentives, the right policies in place to incentivize travel, to incentivize commerce, trade among the regions. I see plenty and a brilliant opportunities in the future if we're able to align those.
Absolutely, thank you. And Sergio Contreras, I will turn to you for any last remarks that you would like to add as we wrap up our panel.
Thank you, Britton. I think the title of this week's conference on building a competitive U.S. Mexico border is part of our DNA, all pun intended, right? And it's in relations to thank you to leading us in the conversation. There are opportunities to ensure that we have a legislative platform that allows us to improve the crossing of legitimate trade, and then also ensuring that we continue the dialogue to have efficient process lines at our ports to do that as well. And I mean all ports of entry, maritime and land port of entry. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. The focus today was revitalizing the cross-border economy. And I think that I know you have done a great job in summarizing solutions and opportunities, and know that the BTA will continue to advocate in Washington and beyond for certainty and request a plan, obviously, that we all need. But most importantly, thank you for your wisdom and shared remarks today. And thank you to Andrew and your team. And I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Britton, and thanks to the panel. As Britton said, really, really fantastic conversation that I think got at so many of the topics that had come out throughout the day or throughout the last 2 days. And to wrap up our last our 2 days of interesting and productive conversations, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Tony Wayne to share some of his thoughts and conclusions. Ambassador Wayne, well known to many, if not all of you, is, among other things, the co-chair of the Mexico Institute's advisory board, and he's also a Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. In those capacities, he coordinates the work of our USMCA working group and works closely with the Canada Institute and the Mexico Institute on our North America programming. So Ambassador Wayne, take us home.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, and thanks to everybody. Thanks, Britton, for hosting a number of the panels over these 2 days. Thanks to everybody for participating. And Andrew, thanks for the innovation of having Chris Sands and some Northern Borderites come and join in this. There are a lot of similarities. If we just step back for a minute and look at the two borders, they're extremely important. If you took either border set of states or provinces and states and put them together, they would be the third largest country economy in the world. And yet there's a real challenge to coordinating across these long borders. Different communities have shared interests, but it's hard to get together across the length of either border to coordinate. And that leads to be very honest, it leads to a weakness for each of the border communities in pursuing their interests in a coordinated way. And a lot of the things that make sense to do along both borders, it becomes harder to get it mobilized to do it. But I think that's the challenge that's out there. And I think in part, if I always say, we should look back as well as looking forward. If we look back to ideas that have come up over the last decade and have been tried on both borders, there are a lot of good ideas there that never really got realized. They got started to improve as the Canadian panel was talking about, collecting data and looking at processes and making, as we heard yesterday, making some of the electronic sharing of that data and sharing of forms and processes faster and easier. A lot of that got started and then just got bogged down. And in the U.S. Mexico part, of course, we had, and I think still exists, a 21st century border working group. The idea was to, in fact, make the border as modern as it should be to handle 21st century traffic. And it did start doing things. But again, a lot of that got bogged down. And then during the pandemic, of course, there was really just not much of anything done in that area because people were dealing with the immediate emergencies. And as was correctly said, people avoided the worst for North American trade by some heroic acts during this period of time to keep those trucks crossing the borders and some of the essential workers crossing the borders, not all of them. But at the same time, as was made quite clear, there was a lot of suffering of that transborder economy, which is very local on both sides of the border. And we have to get back to that. So on the U.S.-Mexico part, I guess I would say that one of the big opportunities is there, and it was just, again, reiterated today, and a specific date was announced, September 9th, for the reconvening of a brand new high-level economic dialogue between the United States and Mexico. This existed during the Obama administration, the Obama and Peña Nieto administrations. And what it did was devise a really interesting set of important economic agenda items that needed to be addressed between the two countries, the United States and Mexico. They didn't really fit fully in NAFTA, and just like they aren't going to fit fully in USMCA. USMCA does a lot of good stuff, but it doesn't deal with border infrastructure, for example. It doesn't modernize the technology on processing across the border. It doesn't do transportation planning for all the roads that lead to and from the border in each country and make sure they make sense and people are talking to each other. So there are many things that can be done in this high-level economic dialogue that can be of great benefit for the border. So one thing to all of you private sector representatives here is I would say get your act together and get your ideas in to both governments right now. You've got a month until they're going to meet. In fact, you have less than a month because they're going to meet on the 9th. So I would get your ideas in, as my mom would say, lickety split, meaning rapidly, to both governments because they're working on this and say what you'd like to see them do. And I agree fully that there needs to be a set of forums that have the private sector, have the local communities, have the states involved, as well as the federal governments. And that's in part why it's so complex. It's hard to get those local dialogues and then the mid-level dialogues and the federal government's all working in sync and working well. But you got to try and do that. There's no way out of that if you want to address these problems. And again, it's more complicated, but it has to be that you have these different levels of government and the private sector involved at each level of conversation, or it's not going to be informed by reality. I mean, the reality is what happens on the ground, and that is a combination of the officials working right there at the border and the private sector on both sides of the border trying to make this happen. So it seems to me that certainly is the challenge for the next several weeks, is to get that message to both Mexico City and those messages to Mexico City and Washington. And then the challenge is really to try and make this happen. And that means you need a process. And you need regional sectoral dialogues that are very efficient, that involve both economic officials and the DHS and SAT and other officials who are manning the border, and the private sector. And then that has to feed into a broader dialogue that's going to inform the policy structures that are going to emerge and the policy agenda that should come out of this high-level economic dialogue. And as one of the questions asked earlier, I asked, which was, shouldn't we get together maybe every 6 months or so on both borders and get representatives from across the border to talk, and then maybe once a year have a North America Border Management Summit where we can take lessons from the best practices on both sides of the border. It seems to me we have to invest. This is so important economically for all three countries. And if we can get a process going where people become familiar with each other, where they become more comfortable, maybe we can make some real progress. I do think everybody was shocked by this pandemic and they went back into a cocoon mode because they were just trying to survive and make things and avoid the worst disasters. We each have, on each border, we've seen moments in the past where there's been very good dialogue. Certainly along the U.S. Mexico border, there have been certain sectors where you've had that right combination of people, where there have been good discussions in those sectors and ideas come forward. It's just time to put it all together, it seems to me. And this is a great opportunity. And so, this meeting was very timely. There were a number of excellent observations and ideas shared, but the work agenda is right there in front of us now. And so I'm very happy for the fact that the Mexico Institute called this together and with its partners. And I think there's a lot of good that we can do really in the immediate right now in helping to shape what the U.S. and Mexican governments are going to do.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ambassador Wayne, for summing up 2 days so well. We really appreciate it. Again, I want to thank Britain and the Border Trade Alliance team. It was great to partner with you and put this together. Thanks to the speakers on the last panel and all of the speakers and presenters throughout the 2 days. And as has been mentioned several times, we hope that when we do this again next year, we can do it in person and have the border come up to Washington, D.C. So thanks, everyone. Take care and be safe.